Hey, what's up guys? My name is Josh and this is balanced headphone cable types explained. So first I want to talk about why you would want a balanced cable, then we'll get into all the different types and why there are so many different types. So the simple reason why you might want a balanced cable like this one is because of balanced amplifiers. Pretty much all of the top players, except for a few exceptions in terms of amplification, at pretty much prices from 300 bucks and up, all of the top players in those price categories are almost all balanced. So if your goal is ultimate sound quality, you're usually going to want to go with a balanced amplifier. Again, there are a couple of exceptions, like in the $100 price category, a Schiit Heresy is flippin' amazing and it's single-ended performance. So if you want to get into that system, you're going to need a balanced cable in order to maximize your use case of those amps. Yes, they do have single-ended, but a lot of the times the best performance, usually in terms of power, is going to be from the balanced side. So as far as balanced cables go, typically you'll see one of these four options. You have a 2.5 millimeter, which is actually a 4-pin 2.5 millimeter. This looks most similar to a 3.5 millimeter, which are unbalanced. Then you have a 4.4 millimeter, which is actually a 5-pin. You'll see them a lot of times be called Pentacon cables. They're really just 4.4 millimeter balanced cables. These are somewhere in between the size of a 3.5 millimeter and a typical 1/4 inch. Then you have something kind of odd, which is probably the most rare on this table, and you won't see it too often, but it does pop up, which is going to be a dual 3-pin XLR, but there's two of them. So each one sends its own signal. You, again, won't see this too often, but we have seen it on amps like the iFi iCan that I reviewed. That does have options for actually most of these. And then by far the most common for full-size headphones is going to be a 4-pin XLR like this. So what do they do differently? Unfortunately, the answer is nothing. They all work on separating the two channels from one another, providing a balanced signal. They all can pass the same amount of energy through. There really is nothing to them that is different besides the connection that they're using. As far as why this happens, it's simply a case that there's no legitimate industry standard. There are just more typical and less typical choices that they make. So today I want to talk about some of your purchasing options and some of the different types of cables that you may want to invest in and some of the adapters that you may want to invest in instead of full-on cables. So I want to talk about the adapter that I think is superior to the others and why. I think it's a 4.4 millimeter balanced cable. And the reason why is because the 2.5 millimeters are really dinky. They're not a lot of metal, so they're more susceptible to breaking. I haven't seen 2.5 millimeters break, but I have seen a lot of 3.5 millimeters break over time. These are a little bit more stable and they last a little bit longer, not nearly as long as the XLR, but the 4.4 does have a benefit over the XLR, which is simply size. So a perfect example of this. So let's say you have an amplifier that you want to keep in a small form factor like this WA11 Topaz from Woo Audio. This is a balance in and balance out amplifier. Actually, it's a DAC amp, and it has a 4.4 millimeter balanced. But if you'll notice, there's really not a lot of room for a full-size 4-pin XLR. So if you wanted a balanced signal out of this, you'd either have to go with a 2.5 millimeter, which again, I don't think is a good idea because it can break, or you would have to make the unit physically bigger. And while it may seem like that's specific to this amplifier, it's actually not. So if you have a complicated device like this iFi IDSD Pro, it's got a ton of different inputs, a ton of different outputs. It's a very beautiful device, it's very well made. However, because of all the different options, it's limited for size. So on the front, you actually have a choice between a 2.5 millimeter balanced and a 4.4 millimeter balanced, but you can't get a 4-pin XLR there. So the 4.4 millimeter seems to offer better size versatility while keeping all of the benefits of 4-pin XLR. Okay, now while I think the 4.4 millimeter is the superior format, I don't think it's the best choice. It might be, and we'll talk about where and when it might be, but in general, you're gonna have far more use out of a 4-pin XLR than you will a 4.4 millimeter balanced cable, because most of the balanced amps right now still do come with a 4-pin XLR and not a 4.4. That is more the exception, whereas the rule typically is going to be the XLR. But again, there are many exceptions. So these specific cables are nice cables. They're the premium cables from Periapt. I just like them for their quality. I do not think that they sound better. I just really like the adaptability that they have. The build quality is far superior over the typical 6XX cable, which is what these are made for. So if you're gonna invest in cables, I would recommend one of these two systems. If you're gonna invest in one side, I would invest in both pieces, not just the one piece. So you can get a 4.4 millimeter balance cable with a 4.4 millimeter to XLR adapter. This will allow you to work with typical 4-pin XLR amps, but also work with the 4.4 millimeter. And then the opposite side here is literally just the same, but flipped. It's got a 4-pin XLR, and then the adapter is to a 4.4 millimeter. But I do have a slight argument to getting the 4.4 with the XLR adapter. And that argument is simply that the adapters are usually cheaper than the actual cables are. And this area right here where it connects to the amp is the area that's probably gonna take the most wear and tear. So if anything's gonna break or wear down over time, it's probably gonna be the adapter, making it more easily available and cheaper to replace. However, for the nicer peri-op cables, I've never seen any of these break, so it's arguable that that's not even something to concern yourself with. Now that, in my opinion, would be the pretty much only argument for the 4.4 millimeter. I think the superior option right now, even though I think it's the wrong choice, is the 4-pin XLR. And it's the simple reason that the adapters that you can get for 2.5 millimeter and 4.4 millimeter are more readily available than all the other reverse options. So, finding 4.4 to 2.5 is relatively difficult. Finding 4.4 to XLR is relatively difficult and not as easily available as 2.5 and 4.4 to male XLR. So effectively they do all the same thing. I didn't bring up the dual 3-pin XLR because that's really not typical, and I don't see any reason to do it whatsoever. All the amps I've seen with dual 3-pins also have a 4-pin XLR out that usually has equal power and equal specs. So I don't see a reason to have something with more inputs to plug in and therefore more things to break. All right guys, thank you very much for watching. I do want to thank peri-op for sending this out. This isn't a review or anything like that. It's just talking about the different types. But they are worth checking out. I've worked with them for a long time, and they're a good company who makes a good product. So definitely check them out. I'll leave links to everything down below, the adapters, pretty much everything I talked about. I'll link it down below. Okay guys, thank you very much for watching. My name's Josh, signing off.